The first thing that's clear is that we are in a different world nowadays in terms of just the discourse, in terms of the chaos, the frustration, and I think the feeling of the people with regard to militaries being used in cities and whether or not that's appropriate. That's the one thing that's clear. The second thing that's clear is that the president has, as we know, a majority of the justices on the Supreme Court. We know that it's really not even close. It's a 6-3 split. Now, why is that important, Jim, when you have the Supreme Court that are not elected, they're appointed, but they're lifetime tenure. They're supposed to be completely inoculated from public, types of perception. They don't care what the public thinks. But it's important because it seems that it's very politicized. It seems that where the Supreme Court may turn out, and I hate to speak like this, right? When I was in law school, it was about the facts and the law, and the facts and the law drive whatever happens. That's not what drives it. It seems ideology does. So what's clear is he has a majority of the Supreme Court, a few of which he appointed, I should add. And so the question becomes, is the Supreme Court going to stay true to constitutional principles and law, or is the Supreme Court going to politicize it and essentially do what the president wants? President has not been checked by the Congress in this country, which has an oversight responsibility. They haven't been exercising it. President hasn't really, and just to some degree, has been checked by the Supreme Court. But in large measure, this is the same Supreme Court, Jim, that said, hey, the president has immunity from criminal prosecution. And the last point I'll make is that all facts are different. Every case turns on its facts. And so the fact in Chicago, was what they were, but the facts in Minneapolis are what they are. And it seems that the people are, exercising their right to protest. Has there been instances of violence? Yes. Does it equate to a rebellion as that term is defined? Not so sure. Last point, and that is, yes, the president has broad discretion. Courts have made that clear too. But does broad discretion mean that you can invent your own facts? And the other cases that I've talked about, the courts have been very concerned about what's happening. And one court went so far as to say that, what the administration is saying is untethered from reality, which was a kind way to say, I don't know if the facts you're pointing to are actual facts at all.
Trump ramps up threats. Tension flared again on Thursday in the wake of a second shooting by a federal immigration officer in just 1 week. This comes as the U.S. president says he may invoke the Insurrection Act to send U.S. troops to Minneapolis amid ongoing confrontations between protesters and ICE agents. Well, a CNN crew in Minneapolis was hit with tear gas as it took this footage of anti-ICE protests. A number of demonstrators have been arrested in recent days over the ongoing immigration crackdown and recent shootings by ICE officers, including one that left a woman dead. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, is accusing Democrats of encouraging the violence.
I think the president's Truth Social post spoke very loud and clear to Democrats across this country, elected officials who are using their platforms to encourage violence against federal law enforcement officers, who are encouraging left-wing agitators to unlawfully obstruct legitimate law enforcement operations.
Well, meantime, the mayor of Minneapolis is among local officials urging the community to remain calm.
And we're in a position right now where we have residents that are asking the very limited number of police officers that we have to fight ICE agents on the street, to stand by their neighbors. We cannot be at a place right now in America where we have two governmental entities that are literally fighting one another.
CNN's Julia Vargas Jones is live for us in Minneapolis. Quite stark words there, as we just heard, Julia. What are you hearing about the ongoing clashes and the president's threat, as we heard yesterday, to invoke the Insurrection Act?
Well, Christina, good morning. What we're hearing from residents here is that they can't even begin to fathom what that might look like to have the Insurrection Act invoked for Minneapolis and for Minnesota. What would that look like after they already have thousands of agents on the streets here? That is why some of them were out there protesting yesterday and the night before. Now we're seeing not a de-escalation as authorities have been calling. The governor calling directly to the president, saying let's find a way to de-escalate this so that we can move forward, at least on a national level. But residents here, protesters, I'll say, not residents, protesters did have some clashes with those forces, those federal police officers yesterday, overnight. Again, an intensification. You know how these go. It's a big flare up and then things calm down again, and it flares up and it calms down again. It does feel like here that just any further intensification could cause a bigger bang, and that's the concern, I believe, from those local officials that are calling again and again for calm. Now, we will be out there again today watching that federal building, the Whipple Federal Building, that has been the site, the staging area for ICE over the past few weeks, to see if there are more protests later today. But we already know tomorrow there is a planned anti-Muslim, anti-immigration, pro-ICE protest scheduled for the afternoon here in Minneapolis, and a counter-protest. Again, we're seeing an escalation, not a de-escalation of the situation here on the ground. And now, one thing that could be a factor, aside from those people that have been reminding their fellow Minnesotans to stay calm, is the weather, Christina. We are seeing temperatures dropping overnight tonight and tomorrow, going down to like 1 Fahrenheit. I believe that's -9, -10 Celsius. That could put a hamper on these demonstrations and perhaps, in a good way, keep things a little bit calmer for a little bit longer. But we're not seeing the rhetoric going away anytime soon.
Yeah, and I just want to reflect again on what the mayor just said there. We can't have two government entities fighting each other. I mean, one hopes that the weather might play a part here in damping down those protests, but there must be real, genuine fear, Julia, of this violence continuing to escalate.
There is. There very much is. And I think that is, you know, the people that we spoke with, Christina, that is the regular people, I'm saying. People who are afraid for their neighbors, who are afraid of their Somali neighbors who may be being targeted by ICE agents, their Hispanic neighbors who may be targeted. They are saying to us, this is unsustainable, to evoke the words of the mayor once again, that Minneapolis cannot continue this way. And I'll add, this is also a city that has seen a lot in the last 5 years since 2020, George Floyd, and that police has done a lot of work to get the respect and the trust of the population again. So having this added layer of mistrust in government entities, be them local or national, it is still very fresh and very raw here in Minneapolis. That is the general reaction where we're hearing from everyday Minnesotans here, Christina.
Yeah, and we will, of course, continue to follow it hour by hour. Julia, appreciate your reporting in Minneapolis. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Laura Coates. You're looking at live pictures from Minneapolis during another tense night between federal officers and protesters. They're moving as we speak right now, appearing to move the crowd out of the street. We'll check in outside the Whipple Federal Building momentarily. Throughout the day, we have seen agents deploying pepper spray. We have seen some people get detained. Protesters have been shouting and occasionally throwing objects in their direction. It's all after last night's incident where a federal agent shot a suspect after DHS alleged that an agent was assaulted. 1 week before, Renee Good was shot and killed by ICE. And now President Trump is once again dangling the threat of invoking the Insurrection Act. He posted this very warning. Warning, if Minnesota politicians don't stop what he calls professional agitators and insurrectionists from attacking ICE, he will invoke that. But what is the Insurrection Act exactly? You'll hear a lot about it, right? Well, it's the big exception to the general rule that keeps U.S. troops from being used for domestic law enforcement. Now, a governor can always ask for this kind of help if there's an emergency. But in certain situations, it lets the president send in the military even without a governor asking for any help. It's designed for out-of-control situations when it's not possible to carry out federal law, or if federal law is being obstructed. And we see, of course, the agents appearing to band together to move in unison to hold a line that we will explore in just a moment. Ultimately, it's one of the president's few unchecked powers, though, to invoke the Insurrection Act. And make no mistake, the commander-in-chief's power to deploy is already extraordinary. So it's not really whether he has the power to invoke the Insurrection Act. No, the question is, does he have sufficient justification to invoke it? Well, let's look at the facts. We have seen multiple nights of unrest in Minneapolis, and while there have been instances of peaceful protest, albeit verbal, there have also been instances when those protests have been anything but peaceful and have devolved into what the Minneapolis police chief described as unlawful assembly. Is that enough to warrant the Insurrection Act? Because that's what this is about. And look, if he really wants to invoke it, he really can. And it's been done before. I mean, not in recent times, but the last time, 1992, by George H.W. Bush during the height of the Los Angeles riots after the Rodney King verdict. But even then, the state asked for federal help. And this situation, obviously, pales into comparison to the vast unrest and damage to the city in that instance. But the last time the Insurrection Act was invoked without a governor of the state requesting it, well, you got to rewind that clock to 1965. Back to the civil rights period when Lyndon Johnson used it in Alabama to protect activists marching from Selma to Montgomery after they were attacked by state troopers on Bloody Sunday. And that gets to perhaps the stark irony here people are exploring, because back then, the Insurrection Act was used as a kind of shield. Federal power was used to protect civil rights. Now, Trump is flirting with using it as a sword, threatening to overrule a state and use federal power to potentially police American streets and, as protesters believe, trample civil rights. CNN's Shimon Prokupez is on the ground for us in Minneapolis. Shimon, we're watching this movement of holding the line, they're retreating, they're advancing. What's going on, Shimon?
So for the past 2 hours, we've been watching as protesters have been kicking cars, throwing things at cars, as there are federal law enforcement vehicles that have been going into this building. And we have watched, and federal law enforcement has done nothing. And here we go. They're starting to throw hold on, let me just come back here. As you can see, basically now they're just deploying tear gas, because what's been happening is that we have more tear gas here. Leonel, let's move back.
We're following you, Shimon. I can hear you. I know you're trying to catch your breath from the deployment of that very disruptive.
Well, they threw the percussion grenades, and then they came from the other side, and they started throwing the tear gas, because they came from behind. So this line of law enforcement that we were in front of was pushing the crowd back. Then from the other side came the other set of law enforcement officials who started throwing those percussion grenades and then tear gas. The crowd wasn't a very large crowd. But Laura, what's been happening? Wow, this is nasty. They've been kicking cars. They've been throwing things at the cars.
Shimon, catch your breath for a second. We're following along with you. I want to give you a second, because what they have deployed is obviously disrupting your ability to breathe and suck. It's intense. I know you're obviously coughing. I want to give you a second and just allow our audience to understand and follow what's happening right now. He is outside of a federal building known as the Whipple Building. This has been the site that many of you have seen over the past several days, where you've had protesters on the other side of an invisible line. When federal agents are holding it, they are allowing different federal vehicles to go in and out. But as they are going in and out, protesters are aware that these are federal agents possibly going in, and they seem to be swarming around the cars. And as you're seeing them advance and retreat, they are trying to allow these vehicles to go through. We are following Shimon Prokupez, who is on the ground, has been throughout the night, seeing this ebb and flow. Shimon, Tell me what's going on right now.
No, I mean, we're watching right here. Lionel, my photographer, is having a little bit of a hard time seeing, but we're going to try to get here. But here you could see federal law enforcement now approaching a group of protesters here. We don't know exactly why, but they're in, I mean, SWAT gear. They're in, I mean, it might as well looks like, military fatigue, but they came from another side. I mean, we did not expect this at all. This line, these dark colored uniforms that you're seeing here, that's Customs and Border Patrol. We saw them earlier in the 8 o'clock hour. They moved out. They pushed the people back, and that was it. They went back inside. Then after that, there were some more tense moments, but certainly this is the most aggressive we have seen them today. I mean, they came from every side. They threw those percussion grenades, and then they just started firing tear gas. And that's when we all started trying to disperse and clear out. But what's been happening here, Laura, through the night, and I have to say, having covered so many of these now, that actually the law enforcement here was very patient with the protesters. I watched as car after car with law enforcement officials go in, come out, dozens of cars, and the protesters would kick the cars, they would throw things at cars, and law enforcement did nothing. They did nothing. And then all of a sudden, finally, I guess around, as you were getting ready to go on air, they had enough. I mean, the crowd had basically decreased. And then all of a sudden, they just came and they swarmed. And this
do you know what triggered it, Shimon? I mean, what did you see any trigger as to why they came from all sides?
Well, what was happening was the protesters were sitting in the driveway, and they warned them several times, get out of the driveway, get out of the driveway, get out of the driveway. And they didn't. And then they continuously were kicking cars, continuously. I mean, every time a car came in, every time a car came out, it was federal law enforcement, and they were kicking the cars. And so as a result of all that, this is where we are now. You could see these are the Customs and Border Patrol officers. They're the ones that have been pushing the crowd back. They were not the ones using tear gas. It's this other group of officers who come out. They have all the gear. They have pepper spray. They have, they could fire pepper balls, and then obviously the tear gas. You could still smell and feel the tear gas here in the air. But I mean, it was quite something.
Shimon, compare the size and number of these agents compared to the number of protesters on the scene.
Oh, I mean, it's by far at this point now, I would say there are way more law enforcement officials and officers than there are protesters. I mean, they really, the point of this clearly, Laura, was to clear these people out. I mean, they had enough. They were letting them kind of hang out. Some of them were just yelling, chanting, doing their thing. But at some point, you kind of expected this because, I mean, enough was enough, I think, for them. And they finally said, okay, we're coming. But this is certainly the most aggressive that we've seen them tonight by far. They came from every direction. Earlier in the night, Laura, I was watching as some of the protesters were shaking the fence, trying to knock the fence down. And, the law enforcement here moved in and they pushed them back, and then it stopped.
Shimon,
but now you're seeing some of them are starting to back up.
Stand by for us.
I mean, this was quite something.
This is unbelievable.
Yeah.
I hear someone with a megaphone. I'm not sure if it's the actual agents or not with the warnings. I know they're retreating. Stand by for a second.
No, it's protesters.
They're protesters. I want to bring in Danelle Harvin to this. He's a former chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence from Washington, D.C. Walk us through as well what you're seeing here. You heard Shimon describe that there had been almost the patience ran out But Customs and Border Patrol agents instead of apparently ICE or local law enforcement or federal law enforcement. Can you describe why that would be the presence we would see enforcing now?
Yeah, well, you have a 7-layer cake out there of complexity and craziness. So the first thing I want to key in on is what Shimon has said, that this was completely unexpected. In state and local civil disturbance, something like that, what we just saw, wouldn't be unexpected. Law enforcement would get on their bullhorns and they would give timed warnings to protesters saying, you're breaking curfew, you're in a place you're not supposed to be, you're going to be pepper sprayed. They give plenty of warnings.
And
so
a countdown almost. Correct.
Shimon should have never been surprised that this happened. But this is the federal way, right? So the federal officers are not trained to de-escalate. These ICE officers are not trained in that space. They're trained to do what they're supposed to do.
So who are we seeing right now?
Yeah, Customs and Border really supposed to be doing work in the interior, right? So they're training, that doesn't mean that they can't. Clearly, we've seen over the last year, they're going around with ICE, supporting ICE. But once again, we're talking about fundamental training. And who's trained to do what? State and locals are best trained to do this work. In fact, the National Guard is even trained better than the Customs and Border and ICE to do this type of what we call civil disturbance work. And so the kind of madness that Shimon is showing is what happens when you have law enforcement that's not fully trained to interact with the public. Now, on the public's end, this is really a failure, I think, of local government, right? If Tim Walz is listening, if the mayor of Minneapolis is listening right now, he needs to protect his people, and the best way they can protect the public is to keep them away from this facility. This facility has a right to operate. People should not be sitting or laying down in front of this facility. It's probably operating 24 hours, and it's not safe for those people to be in front of that facility and blocking that facility. So
Explain precisely how the governor and mayor could ensure that protesters are not on a public forum street, which the sidewalk outside of the federal building normally is a public forum. You're saying that they should block the area in some way to prevent access?
And we've done that in many cities. We've done that here in D.C. Create a space that's legal for them on a sidewalk across the street and show them where they can peacefully protest, that their First Amendment rights will be protected. But I see no local police, maybe we can ask Shimon if there's local or state police out there telling these individuals where they can go. And quite frankly, it's not the federal law enforcement to tell them where they can go and protest, right? It's their job to protect that facility and the comings and goings of that facility. So there is a real gap here, and that's where the public can be legally at to do what they want to do.
Shimon, Donnell's describing a tension here between the responsibilities of local law enforcement and what we're seeing in terms of the border that appears to be created every time those agents are advancing or retreating. The line they appear to be holding is the space where you can lawfully protest and where they do not want them to penetrate.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to look, Laura. This is the stuff that I'm finding. This is the stuff that they were deploying. I mean, there's a bunch of canisters here. So there's this stuff it's all over the ground here. What was your question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I want tell me the line. Where are people able to protest this area? Are they moving people back from a lawful line to protest? What are we seeing?
So yes. So this is the driveway into the, right? You know this area. This is the driveway into the federal building. They have told them they cannot be in this driveway, right? That's the thing. This is off limits, this driveway. But the protesters were there. So then they would come out. If they didn't move, they would push them back. And I can show you here behind Lionel. Let's show Laura. This is the sidewalk. So all of this is free. Like they were allowed to stay here. The street is open. There's traffic. We've been watching cars up and down this street the whole night. I think it's important to know that the local police, Minneapolis police, and the state police have nothing to do with this. They are not here. They have not been here. This has been entirely a federal operation. I will say to you, they did give some warning that people would be arrested, that the federal building was closed, that they have to leave. But, they made these announcements the entire night. But the way in which they came out of this building, Laura, it wasn't just that they were coming this way, right? It's one thing, our eyes are right here. we're watching the CBP officers who are using their tactics, and clearly they're trained in crowd control. And just out of nowhere, the other team of federal law enforcement officers come from this other direction and start firing the percussion grenades, and then they started with the tear gas, and then that was it. And then everyone obviously started running. But no, there usually is never a warning if you're going to deploy tear gas. But they came out with such force here because, like I said, I just think finally for them enough was enough. They gave warnings for people to get out of the driveway. And I do think the kicking of the cars and the continuous attacking the cars, the vehicles, the federal law enforcement vehicles as they went in and went out. I was kind of surprised at one point that they weren't trying to stop that sooner. And then finally, it got to a point where it was, I don't know, it just got very intense, certainly.
We've been watching. Shimon, stay with us. Keep your eyes to the ground. I want to know what's going on and stay safe. We got to go to a quick break. We're going to come right back live out of Minneapolis. A tense scene outside the Whipple Federal Building in Minneapolis. Just moments ago, federal officers used tear gas to push protesters out of a driveway. This is happening on the same day that President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act and send troops into Minneapolis. I want to bring in Douglas Kelly, former assistant U.S. attorney in Minnesota. Douglas, walk me through the legality. Could Trump legally invoke the Insurrection Act here?
Yes, and Laura, let me just say it's an honor to appear on a fellow alumnus TV program. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're here.
There you go. And in terms of the Insurrection Act, I think you hit the nail on the head in your introduction. It is really meant to be used when the civil authorities are overwhelmed and just cannot manage a crisis. And past presidents have interpreted that way, and presidents have been very sparing and use it only in very important kinds of circumstances. Unfortunately, I read one commentator, Laura, that said the Insurrection Act is dangerously overbroad and ripe for abuse. And we happen to know that this president likes to push the limits when he can. It makes it seem as though he may go ahead and do it.
Have any statements? Okay, I want to ask you that. Have any statements that have been made by either the governor or the mayor or local officials or any activity that you have seen through reporting, does any of that add justification for Trump if he were to try to invoke it to suggest that it is not under the control of local officials?
No, I don't think any of the comments that I have heard would justify that it's not in control. I think the governor, the mayor, and the police chief all recognize that it's entirely appropriate for ICE to arrest people who are doing illegal things here in the United States. And the president himself has continued to say we're just going to go after the worst of the worst, and we are targeting people. I believe that the governor and the mayor and all of them have said that's fine. But they have also reiterated you have a right to protest, you have a right to take videos. And I think I've heard the governor and the mayor each say, but please be peaceful when you do it. And I would just say, Laura, that in the past, for example, when you have a substantial part of the southern states where the governors opposed integration of schools and so forth, that's the kind of justification that you would normally invoke to bring in the Insurrection Act. And the governor just saying, you have the right to protest, please do it peacefully. I probably wish he wouldn't have said, take pictures and we can use them for future prosecutions. I think that was unnecessarily inflammatory. But by the same token, I do not think that it justifies the use, such as a governor saying, we will not integrate the schools of Little Rock, Arkansas. It's just not the same.
No, it is not. And yet, the same act being at least dangled for very different reasons. You know, the family of Renee Good, who was killed a week ago yesterday, well, they have hired a law firm to do its own civil investigation, and they sent a letter demanding the government preserve all evidence in the case. I want to play for you what their lawyer said tonight.
I would love to have all the confidence in our government doing what they're supposed to do. But because we know that we're getting stonewalled, our level of confidence decreases. And that's why we have to take the steps that we're taking.
Distrust, a through line in this conversation. But can they force the federal government to cooperate and preserve or even relay the information?
Well, I think a litigation hold would be appropriate for the feds to observe. Clearly the feds are not going to cooperate with them as they do their investigation. And by the way, Laura, I think if I were a civil lawyer representing the family, I would conduct the investigation as well, gather whatever evidence you could, because I think those tapes. And I don't want to judge the tapes yet because we still keep pieces of evidence keep coming out that could affect the outcome of the investigation. But I think one of the sad things is that the feds started off right away with Kristi Noem saying that she was a domestic terrorist and all that stuff. I think the feds ought to preserve the evidence because they know they're going to be sued.
And of course, burden of proof different when it's a private litigant, and of course, a lower burden as well. Douglas Kelly, thank you.
And then here we go. They're moving back. And you could see some of them are Customs and Border.
That was about 10 to 15 minutes ago. CNN Shimon Prokupez outside the Whipple Federal Building in Minneapolis, scene of a string of clashes throughout the day and a week since Renee Good was shot and killed. Protesters face-to-face with federal officers tonight who moved up to meet them, then pulled back. Officers who now outnumber the Minneapolis police several times over. The city's mayor last night called the situation not sustainable and impossible. I want to talk about with CNN senior legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Ellie Honig, also CNN law enforcement analyst and former Secret Service agent Jonathan Wackrow, and former Minneapolis Police Chief Dario Arredondo. Ellie, how broad is the Insurrection Act if the president was to invoke that?
Astonishingly broad, and I think broader than people realize, and broader than even the name suggests. So the president can deploy the military under the insurrection if there's an insurrection or rebellion, as you or I or any normal person might understand it. But also, the president can deploy the military if he believes it's necessary to enforce federal law. That's remarkably broad. And the other thing to know about the Insurrection Act is the courts have made clear that they are going to defer heavily, perhaps entirely, to the president. There's a decision, it's old, it's from the 1800s, where the Supreme Court said the decision to invoke the Insurrection Act is uniquely the president's and it's binding on everyone else. So if he does this, if he takes this precipitous step, he's going to have a lot of leeway, and I think the courts are going to defer to him. And so people understand just one other thing. If the president invokes the Insurrection Act, that means the military, not just the National Guard, but Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, will be patrolling the streets of Minneapolis as if they were police officers. That's the impact of this.
Chief Arredondo, what would an invocation of this Insurrection Act and the involvement of the military, as Ellie just pointed out, what would it mean, in your opinion, for the situation on the streets of Minneapolis?
Yeah, Anderson, and it was very good to hear Ellie's legal explanation of that. It's going to be impactful. As you had mentioned, Anderson, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey yesterday used the word that what is currently